Joining us on the Heister Automotive Group hotline, Matt Brown. He has a newsletter that I subscribe to. I love it. I read it every day. It's called Extra Points, and he covers the business of college sports. And Matt, yesterday I saw you retweeted this New York Times article that was right in our wheelhouse. There's Armando Bacot getting out of his $80,000 Audi. Student, athlete, mogul, question mark? And look, I'm like, hey, it's the New York Times treatment here, right? Let's see where they go with this. And I think you and I are on the same page here. Once again, we find ourselves talking about name, image, and likeness, and the framing is coming from a spot that almost is maddening given the people that they're talking to.
That's exactly it. I felt like almost everything about this story could have been written in 2020, other than a couple of the anecdotes about deals that have already existed. You know, as I read this, the whole thing seemed, look, the UNC's football and men's basketball players are getting all of this, but what does that mean for field hockey? Are they going to go take money away? Like, let's, what a conundrum. As if the people that are paying for an $80,000 Audi for the men's basketball team were thinking, well, we were considering giving that to the field hockey operating budget, but now we've decided to do it this other way. They're describing a tension and a crisis that just doesn't match the reality of almost every athletic director that I've talked to about where NIL money is actually coming from and what's actually what funding is actually at risk here.
Matt Brown, Extra Points, joining us here on the Heister Automotive Group hotline. You know what's unusual to me, Matt, is I in a perfect world, okay, which obviously we don't live in. Yeah. Armando Bacot is actually an example of someone who is doing NIL the right way in terms of he's been at Carolina. He does have a value. This wasn't somebody paying Armando Bacot to go to a school. This was somebody rewarding, and also Armando Bacot having the ability to cash in on his value to North Carolina basketball, which, by the way, is fairly extraordinary. So I don't even know why they even used this as the premise, other than perhaps Armando's marketing people have been aggressive and they send out a lot of emails.
Sure.
But that's the only thing I could think of.
The only other thing I could think of is also North Carolina would be an example of an institution that has a very broad-based athletic department. They sponsor a lot of sports, and it's a school culture that cares about being successful in a lot of sports. And you have an athletic director who I think it is fair to say has been more skeptical of NIL than maybe some other P5 athletic directors on the record. So you add all of those things here together, and if you want to find a boogeyman, you might find some people to talk about it that way. But I completely agree. And if anything, like the fans benefit here because you now have individuals that are compelled to stay and finish their education, their credentialing, to build a better relationship with their fans, communities, and athletic department. And then even the field hockey athlete that they brought in there. It's hard for me, and this is somebody who's kind of an NIL skeptic with my publication, to think, how am I supposed to think it's a bad thing that a field hockey athlete made over $50,000 in NIL? We can't possibly hope to legislate equal outcomes with NIL. We could only hope to force schools to share equal opportunity. But if someone's able to make more money than the median college graduate's going to make 5-6 years afterwards for maybe the most niche sport the NCAA sponsors, that sounds like a win to me.
Yeah, especially a sport where she has zero chance of making $50,000 as a professional.
As far as I know, I don't know if you go to Holland or something, if maybe there's a league that exists, but
well, you just
look at it as a negative. Yeah,
you just nailed it right there. Matt Brown joining us. Extra Points is the newsletter, college sports, the business of college sports. Highly recommend you check it out and subscribe to it. The part that is maddening is you just said the word opportunities, right?
Yeah.
And we hear ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips talk about the opportunities for the student athlete. He still loves using that word. Well, then why are we, to your point, why are we focusing on the amount rather than the fact that she even has the opportunity to do so? Or the idea that, and this is the most maddening part to me in the framing of it, yes, Matson's won 4 national championships. I get that. But Armando Bacot is the highest profile player on the highest profile sport at North Carolina that's won multiple national championships, and he's an ACC Player of the Year candidate. Of course he's going to go make more money. That would be like an AD at a Division II school that you talk to for the newsletter being upset that Bubba Cunningham is making X amount at North Carolina as he's running 42 some odd sponsored sports. Like, let's be logical about this, which gets to my question. Who are these articles for?
That is a really good question. And my suspicion would be for a publication like the New York Times. If I was to look at this less charitably, if you wanted to write an article for the NPR tote bag crowd that doesn't follow this industry, but wants to get riled up about the decadence of Southern state institutions that we certainly would never do at Williams or Amherst. Like,
how dare they?
How dare, right? But then this is perfect. Just like every time they come in and write about SEC football, and you miss the entire thing. Which is that's a whole different cultural thing. If you are somebody that says the word sports ball unironically, this article is for you. Clearly, those are not our people here.
No.
But what bugs me after writing this being on this beat for so long, the central premise, the opening question, what is the potential cost of this NIL world here? I think that's a very important question. If we want to talk here, take Commissioner Phillips at his word and talk about opportunity, there's some important questions to ask about opportunity. Like, in my professional opinion, I believe that talented African-American women athletes are facing structural barriers to have the same amount of opportunities that white women athletes get, particularly within influencer marketing. I think that we should talk about the potential mental health burden that we place upon a 20-year-old who is now faced with commoditizing their personal identity at a time of their life when they might not even know what that personal identity is, or the fact that we ask them to spend 30 hours a week on their sport and now essentially pick up a second job so On3 can write about it, and your parents are pressuring you and maybe your teammates are pressuring you. Those are conversations to have. I felt like in this particular story, we missed all of the real things that are happening that should be talked about and are going back to the same kind of tired trope that's been a hallmark of this coverage, I think, for the last 3 years. That's frustrating to me.
Matt Brown, Extra Points, joining us here on the Heaster Automotive Group Hotline. That's Joe Ovies. I'm Joe Giglio. I'm curious on your take on this, Matt, because I'm looking at NC State this year in football. I'm looking at Wake Forest this year in football, and they both lost quarterbacks. And we can argue about injuries and systems, but to me, it ultimately says I don't think Wake Forest with Sam Hartman was willing to play the NIL game. I don't think NC State with Devin Leary was willing to pay the same price as Kentucky. I think it's fair to say that. At what point does this new NIL system become, well, who's going to participate and who's going to be left at the side of the road?
It's a good question. And I already know of some schools that have changed their thought process about what is our collective going to be doing or what do we have to be doing in the recruiting process simply because their peers are making different decisions. This is a copycat industry for good and for deeply frustrating. Yes. And this is part of it, right? The other thing, though, and I would caution everybody, is I wouldn't waste if your job does not require you to care about this. Like, people pay me to care about it, so I will care about it. But if you're a fan and no one is cutting you a check to follow this, I wouldn't lose a ton of sleep because we could have professionalized model in 3 years and none of these collectives are going to matter anymore.
Yeah.
If we have a collective bargaining agreement, no one is going to be raising money to go help a kid go to North Carolina or Kentucky or Wake because that's going to be governed by a different system. Just like we don't do that here in Chicago to try to get Justin Fields some NFL wide receivers. Like that's a Kevin Warren problem. We don't raise money and funnel it through Portillo's to try to get around the CBA. Like you lose a draft pick for that kind of thing. So this world changes so much so fast that I don't think anybody who is serious about it can be really definitive about, well, this is what that means for NC State. Because, man, the Johnson case might get solved in 9 months, and that's going to change all of these assumptions.
Well, sometimes I feel that the NIL collective, I think what happened at Florida with the NIL collective that didn't actually have the reported $13 million, I think that's going to be a bigger inflection point because these collectives are really going to screw over coaching staffs if they don't get it right. And if I'm a coaching staff, I do not want my future employment tied to some. It's already tied to super rich guys, but now we're actually having the super rich guys promise things publicly that then play out publicly, and that's going to affect your recruiting cycles. Where I could see schools saying, "Whoa, whoa, 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 we got to bring this in."
That conversation is already happening because even if you are a coach who's not at Florida or Miami, you're involved in this thing anywhere, you're probably furious because now through the public, the next class of high school quarterbacks and their handlers and agents and everything else has said, now the market's been set. Yeah. So if somebody somewhere thought that this high 4-star guy was worth 13 million, you're saying that I'm not that good. You're saying you don't trust me in that way anymore. And this is, I've had coaches tell me a deep frustration with NIL because, like I think we've talked about, most people are lying about what these numbers mean. The coaches, assistant coaches, players, recruiting message board people. There's a game of telephone that happens with all of this. That if you bring it in house, that might lead to a level of professionalization in the execution for everything. Being a rich person who's very good at selling cars or pressurized lumber or security services or something, to pick a few at random, does not mean that you're good at university development. It does not mean that you're good at doing things confidentially. It's a completely different business. And I don't think I'm telling tales here. There are some of the rich guys that are leading big collectives tied to big Power 5 brands that their ADs and coaches cannot stand because these are not trustworthy dudes. They're not dudes that you would trust to have a Twitter account. And easy access to alcohol and no editor, because they're going to do things in a way that's going to hurt you, and there's no easy way to hold them to accountability.
Matt Brown, Extra Points is the newsletter, covers the business of college sports, nails it with NIL. Hey man, we appreciate it. We'll talk to you later.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, fellas.